Very good afternoon. I am Shilpa and I welcome you all to the CIT NCERT live phone-in program. Nowadays, we are hearing and reading a term quite often, that is conservation of plants and animals, like on news and on magazine, and also this is one of the chapter in class 8th science textbook. So let's ask Dr. C.V. Shimre, why do we need to study about conservation of plants and animals? Dr. C.V. Shimre is an associate professor in the Department of Education in Science and Mathematics. I welcome you, Dr. Shimre.
Thank you.
And to the viewers, if you come across any questions related to our today's topic of discussion, then you can dial into our toll-free numbers. Numbers are 1800-111-265 and 1800-112-199. You can also send your questions on our official email ID ciet.kishoremanch@gmail.com. Moreover, you can comment your question during our YouTube live streaming, which is happening now, and our official YouTube channel is NCERT Official. So coming back to Dr. Shimre. Dr. Shimre, today we are discussing about conservation of plants and animals. So please do tell us, what does it mean by the conservation of plants and animals?
Okay, yes. So if we're going to talk about conservation of plants and animals, then there are so many aspects that we need to cover. Like, what plants and animals do we have on this planet Earth, and where do they live, how many of them are there, how many of them are at the rate of extinction, or how many are endangered, or what do they feed on, you know, everything, and how do they help the ecosystem, or how do they help us, and things like that. So there are several aspects of plants and animals that we can study when we talk about conservation, and how do we conserve, and all that comes later on. So we need to understand several aspects of those. For example, how many species are there, and how many of them are we supposed to be conserving them? Can we really conserve all of them? If they have gone, the number have reduced so much, then can we increase the number, and what are the strategies that we can do? So these are some aspects that we can learn during this session, you know.
Okay. Dr. Shimre, when we use conservation is something we are protecting or saving something from being destroyed. But animals or plants are already on this earth. So is it about to get destroyed, and that's why we need to conserve?
There are several aspects again in that, because as you said, there are organisms are all living on this planet Earth, and they have been surviving for ages, millions and billions of years. Some organisms, like, you know, some have gone extinct, many have gone extinct in fact, but yes, as we know, yes, we see organisms everywhere, but it's not the same always. We ignore those organisms or the species which have gone extinct, or which are no more available in our vicinity, which we used to see, we don't see them anymore, you know. So things change, which we ignore actually. Otherwise, things are changing frequently and more drastically at this time, and we find that more and more number of organisms are disappearing from the face of the earth, or more and more of such organisms are reducing in the number. And so what's going to happen to the ecosystem, or to the livelihood of people, or for that matter the survival of the planet itself? So what are the consequences that it can have? So there are several things, several aspects that can be learned through this. Yeah.
Okay. So since our childhood, what we do say, this planet Earth consists of infinite numbers of plants and animals. So is it actually infinite, or have we actually identified certain numbers of them?
Yes, for that I can just show you a slide there. For example, we can put on that slide there. So what it says is, there is an estimated amount about number of species or organisms on this planet Earth is about 8.7 million. Okay, 8.7 million, out of which 6.5 million species are expected to be living on land. 2.2 million species are expected to be found in oceans or in water, you know. So, but out of those 8.7 million estimated number, we have so far described only 1.2 million species, just 1.2 million species. That means that 86% of all species on land is yet to be discovered, described and catalogued, and 91% of organisms in the seas or the oceans are yet to be discovered, described and catalogued. So a lot is still to be uncovered, but then even before we uncover, what's going to happen is that many of those species are going to go extinct because of several things that's happening on this planet that human beings have done because of different kinds of activities that we do in our daily life. So Yes, the number is staggering, but then we are still looking for more of those, trying to find out what are the threats that these organisms are facing. But definitely there's a lot of researchers who are exploring for different organisms that's not yet identified so far. So a lot of things are going on out there.
So on this planet, okay, I'll ask you one question, is that there is any collective term for plants and animals, or do we need to explain it individually, like plants and animals, or there is any collective term?
Okay, we use a term called biodiversity. Biodiversity is, simply put it, it's variety of life on the planet Earth, variety of or different kinds of plants and animals on this planet Earth. And it also includes the microbes, microorganisms, you know, so it's everything that has life. So that's called biodiversity. Maybe it's important for us to explain the term species also, because we're going to use that word very often here in this session. So species is a group of population that can interbreed naturally. Interbreed naturally, because there are artificial ways of interbreeding, because they are trying to, you know, hybridize different organisms, different plant species and things like that. So, but when you talk about species, it is a group of population which can interbreed naturally. You know, so that's a term that's going to be useful for us in this session. Then biodiversity, as I said, it includes all living forms, plants, animals, microbes and everything. And so maybe I'm going to use more often biodiversity term instead of using plants and animals in this session.
Okay, so that means in a biodiversity, when we talk about there's the existence of the living organism together, that means there's a link between the plants and animals. So what's the value of biodiversity we'll talk about?
Okay, several things. Again, I have a slide for you there. So value of biodiversity. So basically we classify the value of biodiversity into two: instrumental value and intrinsic value. Instrumental values are those value that we consider useful for humans. That means whatever is useful to us human beings, we call them that this biodiversity provides us instrumental value, you know. So sadly we're focusing only on the instrumental values. For example, what do I get from this? How is this organism going to help me? You know, it's all about our benefit. Let's talk about intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is that a species worth based on its mere existence. You know, just because it exists, so it should be valued as such. But this thing is not being, we are not giving enough importance to this intrinsic value of organisms or the biodiversity. We are focusing more on the instrumental values, how the organisms are going to help us, what it's going to provide us. So what's going to happen is that if we find that some organisms or some species are not important to us evidently, immediately, then we are not going to take care of those organisms, you know. So that's a danger of ignoring this biodiversity which have intrinsic value in itself. And so we should also look after this aspect of intrinsic value that biodiversity provides. And so it's both instrumental value as well as intrinsic value that should be valued, you know, because instrumental value definitely, because they provide us so many things which we are going to learn eventually in this session. Intrinsic value, just because they survive, we are sure that there should be some value in that. We are still not able to explore those importance of existence of such organisms, but definitely I'm sure that they have value in itself, and so that should be recognized and appreciated by us.
Okay. When we talk about biodiversity, we also say that our life cycle is dependent on several facets of it. So what all are the contribution by the biodiversity, of the biodiversity?
Yes, several. You know, if we keep on listing those how biodiversity helps us, then we can list the whole day and we're not going to end anywhere. So, but in nutshell, again I have a slide for you, how does it benefit us. So cultural benefits, let's talk about cultural benefits. It includes the aesthetic sense. For example, how do we feel when we go to nature outside where there is greenery out there? So the feeling that we have, you know, the beauty that nature itself has, not just the trees and plants, even the animals, the birds, you know, the insects, the microorganisms, all organisms that we see, they give us some kind of satisfaction when we see those things. So the aesthetic sense, you know, which it gives us, the feeling of goodness that it gives us, that cannot be measured. So that should be appreciated. That's something that we get from biodiversity. Spiritual benefits. If we look at especially the Indian culture, many of the rituals, we use different kinds of plants and animals in the rituals, in the different kinds of functions and in the forms of worship. And so that again, without those organisms or those plants or animals, then our way of worship will have to change. So that is also giving us some form of benefit. Recreational is something, that's coming up in a huge way everywhere, not just outside, abroad, but even in India, hiking, trekking and all. So there's a lot of nature-based outdoor activities that's coming up in a huge way, especially among the young people. So they just go out, venture out, enjoy the nature, go trekking, different forms of things, or even, going to river rafting and things like that. So it all happens because of the natural things that's out there in nature, so those are the benefits that it gives us. So coming back to the contribution of biodiversity, human provisions. So what are the what do we get from biodiversity? Food is something. Food, you can imagine all kinds of food that we get. It's all biodiversity, right? Plants and animals included. So all kinds of plants and all kinds of animals. So that's what biodiversity provides us. Fiber products such as cotton and wool. So imagine during winter if we don't have wool, so how are we going to survive? So that's something. In summers in India, tropical areas, it's really warm. If you don't have cotton fiber, then the clothing that we have, we're not going to have that. So that's something that also provides, biodiversity provides. Fuel. Fuel is something, again, fuel in the sense that fuel for burning, cooking food, or using for different kinds of activities. So it provides fuel. That's something many people also depend on for their livelihood also. Pharmaceuticals, medicinal plants, and especially in India we have Ayush ministry set up because of the importance of the medicinal values of plants. And so pharmaceuticals, so how much different plants are providing us in the form of medicine, how can we use several different kinds of species in the treatment of different kinds of ailments. So that's being exploited in a huge way, and that has helped us, because before this industries came up, the chemical factories came up, we used to depend on natural things, Ayurveda and all those things which were naturally available. And so, but it's still helping us. We know the importance of that, and so that's being promoted in a huge way now, that instead of using chemical medicines, drugs and all those things, it's always good to go for natural based, plants and animals products to treat different kinds of ailments. Another very important contribution of biodiversity is ecosystem regulation and support. So if we talk about this, if we explain this, elaborate this, then it's going to go on and on. So we'll just speak in a nutshell. So nutrient cycle is something that that is going on. That means how nutrients are being circulated in the ecosystem. Again, let me introduce this word ecosystem. Students have studied this definition or the concept of ecosystem in geography in class 7. So they should be aware about this. But to explain it to them again, what is ecosystem? It is a system. It is an interacting system of biotic and abiotic components. That means all the living forms, interaction of all living forms with the non-living entities. For example, non-living forms or the abiotic components include temperature, rainfall, sunlight, and things like that. So the biotic components include all kinds of living organisms. So the interaction between these biotic and abiotic components, they form the ecosystem. And so what biodiversity does is it maintains the ecosystem. Natural ecosystem is self-regulating. So unless we human beings disturb them, it's going to self-regulate, it's going to maintain itself, So that's what biodiversity does, unless human intervention is drastic. So that's something. Pollination and seed dispersal. This is very, very important, which we tend to give very less importance. We just ignore. When we see a bee, a honeybee, what we do is that, or when we see some bumblebee or any kind of bee for that matter, we're scared. What we do is we're scared because we're scared that it's going to sting us.
Yes.
So that's all we think about when we think of honey. Or maybe we think about honey as such, honey which we get from honeybees. But beyond that, we don't think about it of course, we do study about pollination in our science subject, like how this pollination happens, you know, what these pollinators do, for example, the bees or other pollinating insects and things like that, what they do, they transfer pollen from one plant to another. So that's how, but beyond that, we do not really, I mean, try to understand the bigger picture of that. Bigger picture in the sense that what happens if bees are not there, if pollinators are not there. You're not going to get your fruits, you're not going to get your food, you know, the food chain, the whole food chain or the food web or the ecosystem is going to be disturbed. In the sense that if there are no pollinators, all the fruits that you get are because of the process, after the process of pollination. So if pollinators are not there, pollination will not happen. If pollination do not happen, you'll not have food, you'll not have new plants growing up. But beyond that, what's going to happen is that animals which depends on those plants will also not exist, you know. So the bigger picture of the pollination activity that goes on in the ecosystem is being ignored by us, which we need to really appreciate now. And we know that a lot of species, the number of species of bees are drastically reducing.
Yes.
And it's drastically reducing, and this is going to impact the whole, you know, food production, which we have not really calculated. Otherwise, if this happens, the trend continues, and what's going to happen is it's going to impact the food available in the markets. Okay. We are not paying enough attention. Otherwise, if this happens all over the world, in Western countries, they have really studied about this, and they have found that the supermarkets are going to be half empty soon if the trend continues, if the pollinators or the bee population reduces in the same trend. So that's something that students need to appreciate. The process of pollination, it's not just about the transfer of pollen from one plant to another or one flower to another, but beyond that, what it does, it provides food, it provides new plants, you know, different kinds of food products, and also other animals which are dependent on those plants are going to be impacted. So the impact is huge, so they need to understand that. Then another thing is air and water purification. We talk about forests as the green lungs, you know, green lungs. I'm sure students have studied about this, I think in 7th grade, in class 7, when they studied forests. So it's called, forest is called the green lungs because it absorbs just like our lungs, but it does it, compared to human beings, it does the opposite of that. We take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide, but forests or the plants, they take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. And so they purify air, you know. So that's we are going to, if that's the contribution of, again, plants. So if lesser plants are there, then there is going to be lesser oxygen out there in the atmosphere. Flood control is something which students are quite aware of, again, but maybe they do not pay enough attention again. So how does plants or biodiversity help in flood control is that they have studied about this, I'm sure, when they studied about soil and all those things in the previous classes or previous chapters. So trees, you know, because of, by virtue of its different, I mean, its branching root system, so it holds the soil together, and so the soil is not run off even if it rains. So even when there is heavy rain, first you have the tree leaves and all those canopy there. Then after that, even if it falls on the ground, the soil is still intact. It is not washed away. So imagine a place without trees. It's going to be like there is heavy rain, then all the top soil is going to be washed away by rain. And the top soil, what is important here is that the top soil is very fertile. The fertile part of the soil is the top soil. So if there are no trees, then definitely the topsoil is going to be lost in the process, and so the fertility of the soil is going to be impacted. So, you know, and soil erosion is something that's happening a lot in hilly areas, and that has, I mean, disrupted transportation systems because of landslides and all, I mean, things falling off on the roads, because of which, because the root of the trees have become loose, and so the soil or the rocks on the mountains, they fall on the roadsides, which blocks the roads and things like that. So during rainy season, this is a very big issue, especially in hilly areas. So another thing is climate regulation. I think we are going on and on, but we cannot help it because that's what biodiversity does to us. So climate regulation is something, again, so the more plants you have, what it does is, as we, you know, that it gives out more oxygen. It takes it more important in terms of climate is that it takes in more carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, you know. So it is a greenhouse gas, and so the more greenhouse gas the plants absorb, the lesser greenhouse gas that's going to be present in the atmosphere, and so it helps in controlling or in some way reducing global warming. So that's another thing. Population control is about population control of the organisms. So in a natural ecosystem, the population are controlled by itself, so you don't have an excess of some organism unless we intervene. So other benefits are like economic, scientific and educational. So economic, definitely yes. So many people are dependent on biodiversity. They sell products of plants and animals in different ways, and so that's how they earn their livelihood. Scientific researchers are using a lot of biodiversity, for example, plants and animals in their researches to come up with different drugs or different things, you know. So that's another scientific aspect, usefulness of that. Educational, we learn a lot from nature or from biodiversity. For example, there is something coming up in a big way, biomimicry. Biomimicry is like trying to mimic what nature does.
Yes.
For example, the mouth of a bullet train, the nose of a bullet train, the idea came from a kingfisher bird. Similarly, for example, the aeroplanes, you know, the airplanes, the wings, the idea was from the birds again. Then there is this termite mound. The idea of this termite mound resulted in somebody coming up with a green, naturally controlled building.
Okay.
That means the temperature is naturally controlled, just like in a termite mound, where temperature is naturally controlled. And so when you construct building based on those ideas, what it does to those buildings is that the temperature is lower definitely compared to other kinds of buildings, and so you are using less of energy in those buildings. Another thing that's very important is circular economy, you know. Circular economy is something that we got idea from ecosystem again. As we know that ecosystem is self-regulating, nothing is wasted in an ecosystem. Everything circulates, you know, from one form to another it comes, and even after it dies and it turns into soil and into nutrients and things like. So there is nothing called waste. So same idea is being exploited in business. So how do we make our business circular? So that there's less of wastage or no wastage, you know. So that's something that we have learned. So there's so many things that biodiversity has contributed to us. Yeah.
Okay, understood. But sometimes back you had said that a few animals and plants are on a verge to get extinct. They are endangered, and that's why we need to conserve them. So what are those threats?
There are several threats. When we talk about threats to biodiversity, we can classify them simply into, like, I have a slide for you here. I don't know where is that. So habitat destruction is one thing. Maybe you can just look for the slide there. Oh, there it is. So habitat destruction is one. Habitat fragmentation or disruption. Then another aspect is climate change, impact of climate change. So these are basically the three threats that biodiversity is facing. Habitat destruction is like different kinds of things that we do to the nature or to forest. For example, a very good example is deforestation. So because of which habitat destruction happens. So what we do is that we remove a whole patch of land, you know, for different purpose to suit us, that we can use maybe for setting up industries or things like whatever. But we remove a patch of forest or things like, and destroy the habitat of those living organisms which live there. Habitat fragmentation or disruption is something, it's like, for example, a highway is constructed in the middle of a big forest area, just in between that. So you construct a huge highway, so you're disrupting the whole place, you know. So some organisms will be threatened because of that. I mean that they will find a lot of difficulty in surviving because of that. Some organisms will have no problem, they could still survive, but many organisms, many species might face issues because of such destruction and fragmentation or disruption. Climate change is something, because of climate change so many things are happening. Rainfall pattern is changing, there is drought, there is flood, there is increase in temperature. There are so many organisms which are not able to survive in a very fluctuating kind of, drastic change in the temperature. So if there is change in temperature even for a few points, say 0.2, 0.3 Celsius, even then they are not able to cope with. So they're very sensitive. So there are sensitive organisms out there, species out there which are more sensitive to changes in temperature, and so climate change is something that's a threat to biodiversity. So basically those are three things that we can talk about at this stage.
Okay, I would like you to explain a bit about habitat destruction, because for example it's written deforestation. Deforestation is not always man-made, it's sometimes a natural too. So it's written that it's unsuitable for the species to live there. So what happens when it happens naturally?
Okay, so as students will eventually study in their textbook also, deforestation is something that has been highlighted in the book. So as you mentioned, naturally when it happens. So forest fire is something that happens naturally, right? Uttarakhand, I think we had a few years back. It happens every now and then. In California, something that's happening very frequently. We hear in the news all the time about that. We heard about this in Australia. So there, forest fires are something that's again, climate change is impacting that, global warming. So what happens is that, so when there is forest fire, then a patch of land is gone. So organisms living there are already dead because of fire. But besides that, what's going to happen is that the whole patch of land is now gone. So some organisms need a huge area, for example tigers and lions, they need huge area to live. They roam around in the forest, in the jungles. So if the place is disrupted, then they'll be lost, their survival is in danger. So they might not reproduce, the reproduction rate, the food and all things, all the chain of reactions will happen because of forest fire, because of the clearing away of some patches of land in the forest. So that's something that's going to happen.
Okay, it is also said that the deforestation, that means the less number of trees lead to the decrease in rainfall. How is it this linked?
Students definitely know about water cycle. And they also have learned about transpiration, the process of transpiration. And so plants transpire in the sense that they release water vapor through the process of transpiration. And again, there are different trees, different trees release different amount of water vapor. Definitely bigger trees will, with more leaves, will definitely release more water vapor into the atmosphere. And some trees, they release a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. So this is very important. This aspect is very important because this is going to impact the water cycle. Okay. So this is going to impact the water cycle. So when there is less evaporation, then it's logical that it's going to impact the water cycle, and so you're going to have lesser rain. So that's what it is scientifically proven, that the less trees are there, there is going to be less rainfall. And it's not just in that place, because it is water vapor that we're talking about. So it spreads, so it's not just that place where you cut the trees, but other adjacent places spread over kilometers and kilometers. So that area, that place is also going to be impacted. That also is not going to get rainfall. So yeah, that's how it works.
So when we talk about human are one of the competitive races of living being. So when we just talk about them, man-made deforestation, they have actually contributed a lot in that.
Yep.
So what are the major activities we do which lead to the deforestation?
Several. So I have a slide there. So what are those causes of deforestation? Procuring land for cultivation. Maybe we can put up the slide if students might be interested to see. Procuring land for cultivation. We are converting a lot of land. For example, I have some slides for you there. See, can we show the slides there? Yeah, those are the patches of land which have been cleared for the purpose of cultivation.
And even we can see,
you can see
people cultivating.
Yeah, so you can see some of those. So those are the patches of land. We call this zoom cultivation. So because of which, again, you are clearing the places and you are using it for cultivation. But this is not a very recent thing. This has been, zoom cultivation is something that has been going on since time immemorial. Earlier it was not harmful because they used to practice this called zoom cycle. That means that they'll come back to this place after 20 years, they'll leave this place for like 20 years, then they will regrow and things like that. So that's a whole thing that we can talk about. So we are not going to cover that at this point. But zoom cultivation as such is not bad. It's just that because we have reduced the cycle of the zoom cycle, and that's causing all the problem. We are not giving enough time for that patch of land to regrow, you know, so that's causing the problem. Another thing is that we are using wood products for furnitures and for burning, for fuel, as we discussed before. So different fuels, for example, we use it for cooking, we use it for heating things. Charcoal is something, I have some slides for you there, I think. No, it's lost. So anyway, so making furnitures and fuel, for, that's something that, okay, there it is. So that's a kitchen, typical kitchen in a rural area. Can we have the slide there? So you can see there are a lot of wood product is there. You can see wood being used in cooking also.
Yes.
So you can, a lot of things are going on using wood products. So that's something that we use. But again, this as such is not harmful. But the thing is that we are exploiting too much. That's a thing that's causing problem. Then we also use this charcoal for different things, you know, people who do ironing and all, they use that. People use it for cooking also. So things like, so those are basic things for industries. For road construction, we destroy, I mean, for railway lines, we clear forests, you know, for different things. Some things, so the question is, the debate is that, so then do we not have railway lines in such places, or do we not have roads in such places? So that's a question. So we have to find a way out, the middle way out, that we have to look for places where there will be least destruction, you know, or maybe you can look for places where it's less fertile, you know, things like that. So things, a lot of assessment has to go on before we get into that, before we clear forests or things like that. Yeah.
Okay. So what are the further consequences of deforestation, which maybe we are not aware?
A lot of consequences, we are already seeing a lot of that. For example, global warming, as we said. So air purification of air is not happening so much because of that we are seeing that balance of nature is being disturbed. You are going to lose a lot of biodiversity, a lot of plants and animals, because as we discussed there, so if you clear patches of land, then organisms living there will disappear, the number will reduce, you know. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will increase, as we talked about in the previous slides. Groundwater level will also reduce, you know, as we said, students have learned about this again. So plants, they soak in, they are able to, because of virtue of the roots, they are able to soak in more water and it percolates down the soil, and so because of which the groundwater level is maintained or it is raised. So things like that. Then again, rainfall is going to be impacted because of the consequence of deforestation. Desertification is something, you know, if you remove all the trees or all the grasses from the land, then sooner or later it's going to turn into more or less a desert kind of thing. So that's something, a desertification is something that's going to happen because
you had said that the superficial layer will be gone.
Yeah, definitely it will be gone. There will be no plants coming up, because rainwater will wash away all those you know, soil with nutrients or the humus part of the soil. So then no new plants will grow once you clear those forests. And so if no new plants grow for a long time, what's going to happen? It will become so dry that a desert-like condition will set in. So that's something, you know. Natural calamities, definitely floods and things like that will happen. Yeah.
Okay. I'll take up one question one viewer want to ask. Meera is her name and she's in class 8. She's saying that what ma'am, can we know about the plants and animals which is about to get extinct or are already being extinct?
There are several, you know, there are several. There is a website called IUCN. So if they get into the IUCN list, they will actually see something like this. I have a slide there. I'll just show that slide to them. The last, yes. So they will see something like this. So if they go into this website, if they click India, then all those species which are in the verge of extinction or which are endangered, which are less in number, they will be able to find the exact status of those organisms. So there are some species, I mean some animals and birds there given in this picture itself. So they can see whether they are vulnerable, what is their status, how few they are in number. So it shows the whole thing, you know. So they can get into this website and it will give them a very clear picture of the status of different organisms in different parts.
Okay. So Dr. Shimre, till now we have understood the value of biodiversity, the contribution of biodiversity, and also about the animals and plants which is about to get extinct. But as an individual, what kind of contribution we can do to save our biodiversity?
There are a lot of things that we can do. One thing is that use minimum. Don't use so many things if you don't require it. For example, if you don't need, we say that clothes, as long as you wear cotton clothes, it's fine. It's not fine, because the more clothes you buy, the more cotton you are going to grow, you know. So it impacts the biodiversity. So if everywhere we start growing cotton, then what's going to happen in the ecosystem? We are going to clear more land to grow cotton, you know. So that's something. Then there are several other things that you can do. For example, do not waste food. So that if you don't waste food, that means that lesser will be planted, lesser will be grown. So avoiding wastage of food is something that they can do. Then try to maintain some natural patches of land or garden in their vicinity, in their homes. So do not convert everything into beautification thing. Leave something natural, leave something wild, because that's where different kinds of plants of flowers, tiny flowers are there, where pollinators will come. So the biodiversity will be maintained if you maintain the places in its natural condition. So as far as possible, try to keep some places in its natural condition as far as possible.
Okay, as a part of the strategy to conserve our biodiversity, students have replied, ma'am, please tell about the reforestation. Though we are not have a lot of time, maybe just like one sentence.
One sentence. Reforestation is like you try to regrow the places by planting new trees, you know. So reforestation is definitely one of those strategies that you can use to improve the status of the earth, you know. So you can heal the earth by actually reforesting, but that's not the only solution. You have to do so many other things. So that's just one aspect of trying to do something for the environment. So that's
And also reforestation doesn't mean that we'll start chopping up trees and instead of that we'll start planting trees, because growing up trees takes a lot of time.
Yeah, that's right.
So today what we discussed about the importance of our biodiversity, and also we discussed about the deforestation, and the opposite of it we just discussed, that is reforestation, and we also discussed a bit about the strategies to conserve on the individual part. And thank you so much, Dr. Shimre, for being with us.
Thank you.
And in the next session we shall talk on importance of alphabet in Hindi for class 6. So be with us, we will be back after a short while.